They say honor never fades, it only waits for the right moment to rise again. Sometimes it happens not on a battlefield, but in the quiet aisles of an airplane. This is the story of an old soldier, a forgotten seat, and the moment dignity returned in the most unexpected way. If you believe kindness still matters in this world, stay with me through this journey and let's remember together what true respect looks like. Don't forget to follow, like, and share your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this one remind us why we should never stay silent when honor is at stake. The early boarding call rang out across Terminal C at Denver International Airport. Dawn still pressed faintly against the glass walls, and the fluorescent lights above carried a weary hum. At Gate 27, among the chatter of families and the rustle of carry-ons, sat Frank Delaney. His back was straight, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his movements marked by the discipline of years long gone. At 78, his frame was wiry, his face weathered, and his walk slow but steady. If you looked closely, you would notice the limp, a stiffness in his left knee, the kind of injury no age alone could explain. Frank had booked this flight months earlier, paying extra from his pension for one thing: Seat 14C, an aisle seat in premium economy. It wasn't a luxury, not to him. It was a necessity. That seat meant enough space to stretch his leg, to keep the old wound from seizing. The memory of how it had been shattered, shrapnel and fire in a jungle half a world away, remained with him, a shadow carried into old age. But today wasn't about the past. Today was about the future, about a granddaughter waiting in Annapolis, ready to graduate from the United States Naval Academy. She would be the first Delaney to wear the uniform after him. Frank had promised himself he would be there, no matter what. He boarded quietly, offering the gate agent a soft thank you, gripping the rail for balance as he entered the narrow jet bridge. Once at row 14, he lowered himself slowly, carefully into his seat, stowed his small duffel beneath the seat ahead, and allowed himself a long exhale. For a moment, relief washed over him. The flight would be long, but manageable. He had done everything right. Then came the commotion. 3 rows forward, a mother with 2 small children tried to organize her bags while keeping a toddler balanced on her hip. Another child tugged at her sleeve, whining, while the third clutched a stuffed toy, confusion written across his face. The scene drew the attention of a flight attendant, a young woman in a crisp uniform with her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed part of her smile. Her name tag read Kayla. She leaned down to speak with the woman, then tapped rapidly on her tablet. After a pause, her eyes flicked toward Frank. Straightening her posture, she walked down the aisle with brisk, practiced steps. "Excuse me, sir," she said, crouching slightly at his row, her smile polite but firm. "Are you seated in 14C?" Frank looked up from his folded hands. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, voice steady. Kayla kept her smile. "We have a family that needs to sit together. A mother and her 3 children were separated during booking. Your seat, along with the 2 beside it, is the only block available. Would you be willing to move?" For a moment, Frank said nothing. His brow furrowed, his eyes flicked briefly toward the family, then back to her. "This is my assigned seat," he said quietly. "I booked it early because of a service-related knee injury." Kayla hesitated, but only briefly. "I understand, sir, truly I do, but it's just for this flight. We really appreciate your cooperation." The silence between them stretched. Frank shifted slightly in his seat, the stiffness in his knee sending a reminder of why he had chosen it. "What's the alternative?" he asked at last. Kayla tapped again on her screen. "Seat 32B, she answered. "It's further back. Middle row." Frank blinked. "Middle seat?" "Yes, sir," she said quickly, lowering her voice. "It's the only seat left unoccupied." Frank knew the layout of planes well. Row 32 meant cramped quarters near the lavatories, turbulence, and little room to shift. His knee would lock in minutes, the pain biting harder with every hour. He shook his head slightly. "I'm sorry, miss. I can't sit there. My leg won't make it through the flight." Her smile faltered, but her tone hardened. "Sir, if you choose not to move, we may not be able to depart on time." The implication landed like a stone. Passengers nearby had grown quiet, ears tuned to the exchange. Frank could feel the shift in the air, the judgment in the silence. To them, it must have looked simple, an old man refusing to help a mother with children. A selfish passenger standing in the way of departure. His jaw tightened. He looked directly at Kayla, voice calm but firm. "This is not acceptable." She exhaled slowly, professional mask still in place. "I'll note that, sir, but I need a decision." For a long moment, Frank sat still, his thoughts heavy. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He had endured worse than discomfort, but he had chosen this seat for a reason, one tied to scars unseen. Yet now, with dozens of eyes on him, he felt the weight of being labeled a problem. Slowly, painfully, he unbuckled his belt. As he stood, gripping the headrest for balance, his voice carried quietly but clearly. "Name's Frank Delaney, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired. I'd like it noted that I gave up a medically necessary seat under pressure." Kayla nodded briskly, already motioning for the family to come forward. The toddler reached out with a curious smile as Frank gathered his bag. Frank gave the boy a small nod, gentle, resigned. No resentment, no drama, just a man accepting what was forced. The long walk down the aisle to row 32 felt heavier with each step. He lowered himself into the cramped middle seat between a college student lost in his headphones and a businessman already jockeying for armrest space. The overhead light was broken. The air carried a faint tang of cleaning chemicals and old coffee. Frank adjusted his leg as best he could, a grimace tightening his face as the space pinched him in. No one said a word. No one offered help. No one even looked his way. But someone was watching. 3 rows ahead, across the aisle, Charlotte Hayes, a woman in her 40s with a blazer neatly folded on her lap, kept her eyes on him. She had boarded quietly, laptop in hand, but now it rested forgotten. She had seen everything: the hesitation, the forced move, the limp hidden beneath dignity. And as she studied the old man shrinking into that middle seat, she felt a weight of her own. Some moments, she thought, you could not stay silent. Her phone buzzed faintly in her palm as she typed a message to a friend in airline customer relations. Passenger Frank Delaney forced to give up aisle seat 14C despite confirmed booking and medical need. Now seated 32B. Crew dismissive. Please escalate. She hit send, then locked the screen. She didn't know what would come of it, but she knew one thing with certainty: silence was not an option. Frank closed his eyes, his hands folded loosely on his lap, shoulders drawn inward. The middle seat always made you feel smaller, but this was vanishing. And somewhere behind him, whispers of judgment still lingered in the air. A quiet verdict cast upon a man who had once carried the weight of war on his back, and now carried only the quiet ache of being forgotten. The hum of the engines vibrated faintly through the cabin as passengers filed in, stuffing overhead bins and settling into their seats. The flight attendants moved briskly, their smiles mechanical, their voices rehearsed. But in row 32, Frank Delaney sat motionless, his frame pressed uncomfortably between strangers, his body already beginning to protest the confined space. The college student on his right adjusted his headphones, the bright glow of a tablet screen lighting his young, unconcerned face. He was absorbed in some movie, oblivious to the older man beside him. To the left, a businessman in a navy suit clacked away on his laptop, elbows spread wide, spilling into Frank's space without acknowledgement. Between them, Frank folded inward, shoulders drawn tight, his hands resting on his thighs. His knee throbbed with every second, the joint locked at an unnatural angle. He shifted slightly, attempting to ease the pressure. A sharp sting radiated from the old wound, forcing a hiss of breath through his teeth. Still he said nothing. Complaints had never been his way. Decades of service had trained him to endure, to adapt, to remain silent even when pain screamed through bone and muscle. Yet here, trapped in the narrow seat, his silence carried another weight, the burden of invisibility. The flight attendants passed him by with barely a glance. They tugged on latches, checked seat belts, smiled at mothers with children, and reassured nervous travelers. Not once did they pause at his row. Not once did they acknowledge the man who had been displaced, the veteran whose dignity had been traded for convenience. To them, he was just another passenger, and worse, one who had caused delay. Frank kept his eyes closed, trying to steady his breath, but memory had a way of intruding when silence wrapped too tightly around him. The low throb of the engines became, in his mind, the echo of helicopters. The chatter of passengers faded into the desperate shouts of young Marines. He was 22 again, boots sinking into mud, rifle clenched in his hands. He heard the crack of gunfire, the explosion that tore the air apart, the searing pain when shrapnel ripped through his knee. His body shifted in the seat, as if resisting a memory he had long ago learned to bury. He pressed his hand against the armrest, but the businessman's elbow remained fixed there, unmoved, claiming the space. Frank withdrew his hand without a word. His silence was no longer discipline. It was resignation. 3 rows ahead, Charlotte Hayes kept her gaze discreet but unwavering. She had noticed everything, the limp, the way Frank lowered himself into the seat with effort, the pain masked beneath stillness. She had also noticed what others missed, the set of his jaw, the scars on his hands, the way he carried himself even while diminished by circumstance. She knew the look of someone who had endured more than an inconvenience. Charlotte's phone buzzed faintly in her palm, a reply to the message she had sent. Forwarding to operations, unacceptable. Will notify cabin if escalated. She stared at the words for a moment, then slipped the phone face down on her lap. She hadn't expected miracles, but at least she had tried. Sometimes she thought that was all one could do, act when no one else did. The overhead bins clicked shut one by one. The senior attendant moved through the cabin, offering perfunctory nods, ensuring order before departure. She did not stop at Frank's row. She did not pause to apologize or explain. To her, the problem had been solved. The family seated together, the flight able to proceed. The man in 32B was no longer a priority. But for Frank, the flight had not yet begun. And already it was endless. Every few minutes he adjusted slightly, trying to stave off the stiffness that threatened to lock his leg. Each adjustment brought only temporary relief. He leaned against the seat back, then away from it, shifted his foot forward as far as space allowed, then drew it back again. Nothing worked. His body, once trained for endurance, now fought against him. And yet, there was no complaint, no request for assistance, just the stillness of a man who had learned that to draw attention often meant to invite dismissal. The world no longer looked at him with the respect once granted to his uniform. Now, at best, it looked through him. In the cockpit, Captain David Miller adjusted his headset, his eyes scanning the instrument panel. A veteran himself with more than 2 decades of Air Force service, he carried the habits of discipline into his role as pilot. Checklists, precision, calm. His world was measured in details. Yet when his console blinked with a red notification, his rhythm faltered. He tapped the screen. A corporate liaison message appeared. Passenger concern flagged. Frank Delaney, Flight TC-306, veteran force from medically necessary seat. Issue reported by Charlotte Hayes, Diamond Elite PR board advisor. The name struck him immediately. Delaney. It wasn't common, not among his generation. He leaned back in his seat, the hum of pre-flight checks fading in his ears. Hold taxi, he said abruptly to his co-pilot. Captain, the younger man asked, startled. Hold position, Miller repeated, already unbuckling his harness. His voice carried the authority of someone who did not explain, only acted. He rose, adjusted the cuffs of his uniform, smoothed the gold stripes on his shoulders, and stepped through the narrow corridor behind the cockpit. The lead attendant met him with confusion. Her brow furrowed as he gestured for explanation. A man was relocated, she began, to accommodate a family. He's in 32B now. Miller listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once, resolve hardening in his features. Without another word, he began walking down the aisle. Charlotte noticed him first. The shift in the cabin was immediate, like air pulled taut by unseen gravity. Conversations stilled, phones lowered, and heads turned. Even before passengers registered his rank or uniform, they sensed authority in his stride. Calm, focused, intent. In row 32, Frank sat with eyes half shut, startled only when the shadow of the captain fell across him. He opened his eyes slowly, confusion flickering as he looked up. The captain stood tall, his posture impeccable, the gleam of silver wings catching the overhead light. Then with deliberate precision, he raised his right hand in a crisp, formal salute. For the first time since boarding, the cabin fell utterly silent. The captain's salute hung in the air like a silent command. Passengers shifted in their seats, the hum of the engines fading beneath the weight of the gesture. For a heartbeat, the cabin seemed frozen in time, an entire flight of the strangers bound together in one shared moment of recognition. Frank Delaney blinked up at him, his body stiff with both surprise and discomfort. He had not expected attention, let alone respect delivered so openly. His eyes searched the captain's face for explanation. What he found there was not pity nor obligation, but a fellow soldier's resolve. "Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney," the captain said, voice steady and deliberate. "On behalf of Transcontinental Airlines and as a fellow serviceman, I offer you my deepest apologies." The words carried across the cabin, clear enough for every passenger to hear. Murmurs rippled through the rows as people leaned forward, heads turning to witness the exchange. "You should not have been asked to move from your seat," the captain continued. "It was an error, and we are going to make it right." Frank opened his mouth, but no words came. His instinct was to dismiss the apology, to wave it aside as unnecessary, yet something in the captain's tone kept him still. It was not a performance. It was a correction. One soldier recognizing another. The captain turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping the aisle. "Is Ms. Kayla Bennett in the cabin?" The young flight attendant stepped hesitantly from the galley, her face pale, her tablet clutched like a shield. "Yes, Captain," she replied, her voice unsteady. "You will personally escort Staff Sergeant Delaney to seat 1A, he instructed calmly. Kayla blinked, momentarily frozen. "Captain, first class is—" "If 1A is occupied," the captain interrupted, his tone firm but not raised, "you will ask for a volunteer. If no one volunteers, you will explain that the captain of this aircraft is requesting that seat on behalf of a decorated combat veteran." The words fell like stone into silence. No one dared move, yet every passenger felt the shift of something greater than airline procedure. Frank placed his palms against the armrest, preparing to stand, but the captain raised a hand. "Please," he said quietly, "let us correct this. We owe you that much." For the first time in years, Frank felt hesitation, not from doubt, but from disbelief. To be seen, truly seen, was foreign. Slowly, carefully, he rose from the cramped middle seat. His left knee buckled slightly, but the captain was already there, a steadying hand beneath his elbow. The businessman on Frank's left drew back quickly, shame flickering across his face. The college student pulled off his headphones, his eyes wide as if realizing for the first time the significance of the man who had sat beside him. As Frank stepped into the aisle, silence deepened. Every row seemed to straighten as he passed. Some passengers lowered their eyes, others leaned back, but none remained indifferent. A middle-aged man in a ball cap pressed his hand against his chest in silent salute. A mother pulled her child close, whispering something into the boy's ear. Charlotte Hayes felt her breath catch. She had expected an escalation, perhaps an adjustment, but not this. The sight of the captain guiding Frank down the aisle stirred something deep within her chest, a reminder of dignity long overdue. Kayla walked ahead stiffly, her movements mechanical. She stopped at the first row, turning toward the passenger in 1A. The man sat comfortably, sipping from a branded water bottle, his polo shirt crisp, his demeanor relaxed. He looked up, confused by the attention. "I'm sorry, sir," Kayla said, her voice cautious. "We need to reassign your seat." The man frowned. "Reassign? What for?" "Captain's request," she explained. The passenger turned, his eyes landing on Frank. For a moment, he studied the older man's limp, the weathered duffel slung over his shoulder. The lines of exhaustion etched into his face. Recognition dawned. Without hesitation, he stood. "Sir," he said quietly to Frank, "it's an honor." Frank dipped his head, words failing him. He shifted awkwardly, the gratitude heavy in his silence. The captain turned toward the cabin, his voice raised just enough for the first rows to hear. "If that seat had not been given," he said evenly, "I would have reassigned my co-pilot's jump seat. And if that wasn't available," he paused, his gaze sweeping the attentive faces, "I would have given up mine." The declaration carried down the aisle like a current. Passengers exchanged glances, some ashamed, others inspired. Kayla's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. The statement had not been meant for her alone. It was for everyone present, a reminder that honor outranked convenience. Frank lowered himself carefully into the leather seat of 1A. The contrast was immediate. The space, the quiet, the dignity. A flight attendant appeared almost instantly with a blanket and a bottle of water. Her movement softer now, her voice quieter. Yet none of it touched him as deeply as the gesture itself, the recognition that his place mattered. As he adjusted himself into the seat, a voice rose from midway down the cabin. It was steady but shook with emotion. "Staff Sergeant Delaney." Frank turned his head, startled. A man in his late 30s stood tall in the aisle, jeans and a hoodie clinging to his frame. His scalp was shaved, his eyes wet with restrained tears. "I served under you," the man said, his voice cracking. "Camp Leatherneck, 2006. The recognition hit Frank like a wave. His brow furrowed, his lips parting as memory reached for the name. "Corporal Reeves," the man whispered. The air in the cabin tightened. Passengers leaned closer, sensing the weight of history shared between the two. "You saved my life," Reeves continued. "We never got to thank you." His voice broke. He tried to speak again but failed, the emotion too thick. Instead, he nodded sharply, his chest heaving, and sat back down, covering his face with his hands. Tears streaked silently down his cheeks, and still the cabin remained hushed, every passenger bearing witness. Frank looked away, his jaw tight, his eyes shimmering with unspoken feeling. He did not need to speak. The silence carried more than words ever could. The captain stood a moment longer, then stepped toward the intercom and alcove. He adjusted the switch, his voice steady as it rang through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we depart, I need to make a brief announcement." Every head turned. The hush was absolute. "Today, a mistake was made," he said, his tone firm yet calm. "A man who served this country, who carries both the visible and invisible scars of that service, was asked to give up his seat, not because of airline error, but because of a policy that prioritizes convenience over honor." His words resonated like steel, cutting through the quiet. "Let me be clear," he continued. "We will not take off while injustice sits quietly in our cabin." A shiver passed through the rows. Charlotte's hand pressed against her chest, her throat tightening. "He is Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney," the captain said, "a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. He fought in Quai San, Vietnam. He did not ask for special treatment. He simply asked to keep the seat he booked, so his leg would not lock up from a service injury. We failed him." His voice softened, but it did not waver. "But we don't leave our own behind. Not in combat, not at 30,000 feet. For a moment, there was only silence, heavy, charged, expectant. Then a single pair of hands clapped. Another joined, then another. The sound swelled row by row, section by section, until the cabin was filled with applause. Not loud, not theatrical, but steady and sincere. A wave of acknowledgement, of reverence, of something rare in a world too quick to forget. Frank sat still, silent, but for the first time in years he felt seen. Charlotte wiped the corner of her eyes. She had not expected tears, yet they came freely. In that instant, she remembered something she had almost forgotten. Honor does not fade. It waits. And when the moment calls, it rises. The applause rolled through the cabin like a tide, ruxing and falling until it became something more than noise. It became unity. Not every passenger clapped, but none looked away. In that moment, silence had transformed into reverence, and reverence into a collective acknowledgement of the man seated quietly at the front. Frank Delaney did not lift his hand to his heart or bow his head. He simply sat in 1A, his weathered hands resting on his knees, his eyes cast forward. Yet the applause reached him all the same. For decades, he had carried the weight of memories that no one asked about and few wanted to hear. Now, without a word of his own, he felt a truth he had almost forgotten. He was not invisible. The captain's voice over the intercom still echoed in the minds of those aboard. His words had not been elaborate, but they carried the gravity of something greater than policy. It was not about upgrades or airline hierarchy. It was about the restoration of dignity. As the clapping subsided, passengers exchanged glances, some smiling faintly, others wiping at their eyes. A few reached discreetly for their phones, not to post, but to record the moment for themselves, as if needing proof that honor still existed in ordinary places. Across the aisle, Charlotte Hayes sat motionless. Her laptop remained unopened, her phone forgotten. She felt an ache behind her ribs, the kind of ache that came not from sadness, but from something deeper. Recognition of justice when it finally appeared. She had not expected her message to change the course of the flight, yet watching Frank seated with respect restored, she felt a quiet satisfaction. This was what it meant to act, even when no one else did. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted in subtle ways. The businessman who had earlier fought for armrest space now sat straighter, his laptop closed. The college student who had ignored Frank glanced toward the front repeatedly, shame flickering across his young face. Even the family seated together in row 14 seemed subdued, the children quieter, the mother watching with uncertain eyes. As the crew prepared once more for departure, the hum of engines rising beneath the floor, a new sense of stillness settled over the passengers. It was not the restless stillness of waiting, but the reflective kind, the sort that comes after witnessing something that matters. The plane ascended into the morning sky, sunlight breaking through scattered clouds. Frank gazed out the window, the light catching his lined face. For the first time in years, the ache in his knee was not the only sensation he carried. Beneath it pulsed something steadier: dignity. Hours later, as the aircraft cruised steadily at 30,000 feet, a soft voice carried across the cabin. "Sir?" Frank turned his head. A young man in uniform, civilian clothes but military posture, stood just beyond the curtain separating first class. His hair was cropped short, his stance disciplined. He was no longer active duty, but the bearing remained. "I wanted to thank you," the man said, voice low but earnest. "My father served in Vietnam. He made it home, but not all of his friends did. Hearing your name, seeing the captain salute you, it reminded me of him." Frank nodded once, the smallest of gestures, but enough. The young man saluted briefly, then returned to his seat. Charlotte watched the exchange from her row, her throat tightening again. These were not scripted acts of kindness, not orchestrated displays. They were raw, unplanned, honest. Each one added to the tapestry of recognition, slowly weaving itself around Frank. Later, as the attendants moved through with service trays, the tone of their interactions had changed. Gone was the brisk efficiency, the flippant politeness. When they approached Frank, their voices softened, their movements carried deference. One placed a meal tray gently before him, whispering, "Thank you, sir." Another brought a pillow unasked. Frank accepted each gesture with quiet grace. He was not a man who sought attention, and he did not bask in it now. But his eyes, usually steady and guarded, betrayed the faint glimmer of something rare: acceptance. The flight stretched onward, the hours marked not by impatience but by reflection. Conversations hushed and then resumed with a gentler rhythm. People seemed slower to complain, quicker to yield. What had begun as a routine journey had become a lesson, unspoken but shared. Honor, when acknowledged, changes everyone it touches. When the wheels finally touched down in Annapolis, the cabin erupted in the usual shuffle. Overhead bins opening, bags dragged down, seatbelts unbuckled. Yet for Frank, there was no rush. He remained seated in 1A, his hands resting calmly, waiting. For once, he did not feel pressed to prove his place or justify his need. For once, he simply was. The crew at the door did not thank him out of habit. Their words carried sincerity. "We're grateful for your service, Mr. Delaney," one attendant said, bowing her head slightly. Another added softly, "It was an honor having you aboard." Frank nodded, his reply short. "Thank you." But in his eyes, gratitude and disbelief mingled. As he stepped into the jet bridge, Charlotte followed just behind. She hesitated only a moment before reaching out, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. He turned surprised. "You reminded all of us who we're supposed to be," she whispered. His expression softened, the weight of years visible in his gaze. He dipped his head, unable to summon more. At baggage claim, Frank's granddaughter waited in her crisp midshipman uniform, a handmade sign trembling in her hands. "Welcome, Grandpa Frank." When she spotted him, she dropped the sign and ran, her arms flung wide. He didn't brace for the impact. He let her crash into him, her hug fierce and unrestrained. "Your knees!" she exclaimed, pulling back in alarm. Frank chuckled softly, his voice gruff but warm. "I've had worse." For the first time in too many years, his smile reached his eyes. They sat for hours that afternoon, talking, laughing, sharing. She asked about his past. He asked about her future. She spoke of her training, her ship placement, her hopes after commissioning. He listened, pride swelling, though he hid it beneath his quiet demeanor. When she asked what had happened on the flight, her phone buzzing with news alerts and messages from friends who had seen clips online, Frank kept it simple. "I had a bad seat," he said, "and someone stood up." She frowned, puzzled, but let it go. Later that evening, when she saw the video herself, the captain's speech, the applause, the salute, her eyes brimmed with tears. She hugged him again, longer this time, and did not let go. The story of that flight would spread far beyond the cabin. But for Frank, the truest recognition was simpler. The embrace of family, the knowledge that his service, his sacrifice, and his dignity had not been lost in the shuffle of time. As he sat quietly that night, his granddaughter asleep nearby, he let the weight of the day settle over him. For the first time in decades, he believed it fully. He had not been forgotten. The days following Frank Delaney's flight unfolded differently than he expected. He had thought the incident would fade into memory, just another moment of endurance in a long life of sacrifices. But the world had other plans. 2 mornings later, a thick envelope arrived at his small house in Rock Springs. The return address bore the familiar insignia of Transcontinental Airlines. Frank opened it slowly, his hands steady but cautious, as if expecting a form letter or token gesture. Inside, he found neither. The letter began with an apology, formal, yes, but more than that. It acknowledged the mistake directly, citing his unjust displacement and the failure to honor his service. Enclosed was a full refund for his ticket, but the final lines caught him off guard. "As of today, you are designated a lifetime guest of honor with Transcontinental Airlines. No more booking codes, no more fees. Wherever you need to go, we will get you there. Signed, TCA Veterans Council." Frank sat still, the paper resting across his lap. A refund meant little, travel privileges even less. What struck him was the phrase, guest of honor. It was not about perks, it was about recognition. After decades of quiet invisibility, someone had placed his name in a place where it mattered. He folded the letter carefully, set it beside the folded flag in his study, and let the silence around him speak. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one was heavier, its seal marked with the crest of the Department of the Army. Frank frowned, his pulse quickening as he slid a knife along the edge. Inside was a short, typewritten note. The Army had reopened his personnel file after a public inquiry. A retired officer working in archives had discovered an overlooked action report from 1968. The document confirmed what Frank had long known but never spoke of. During a firefight at Khe Sanh, he had pulled 6 wounded Marines from a burning vehicle despite his own knee shattered by shrapnel. The record had been misplaced, lost in the chaos of that year. Now it was restored. At the bottom was a signature, General James E. Lockhart. Beneath it, a second sheet lay folded, a handwritten note. "Frank, I was Corporal Turber 3 in that vehicle. You don't know me, but I've known you every day since. I'm alive because of what you did. I made it home. I made a family. I made a life. All because a Marine who limped worse than me refused to let go. Thank you. You were never invisible. Not to us. General J. Lockhart, USMC Return." Frank stared at the words until they blurred. He had never asked for recognition, never sought medals or honors, but the letter brought with it something deeper than awards. It was proof that sacrifice was not forgotten, even if time tried to bury it. He set the letter beside the airlines, the 2 symbols of acknowledgement resting together. For the first time in a long while, his chest felt lighter. Meanwhile, far from Rock Springs, Charlotte Hayes sat at her desk in Richmond, Virginia, typing steadily. She had replayed the events of that flight in her mind countless times. The images vivid, the captain's salute, the hush of the cabin, the applause. She knew the story needed to be told, not dramatized, not embellished, but preserved as it had happened. Her article was simple. It described an old man asked to move, a captain who intervened, a silence that turned into ovation. She submitted it to a regional publication, expecting it to reach a modest audience. Instead, it spread like wildfire. Local news outlets picked it up, then national ones. Within days, the salute at 32B became a headline. Clips of the captain's intercom speech circulated online, viewed by millions. Veterans groups shared it, schools read it aloud, and community halls posted it on bulletin boards. A single photo, Frank seated in 1A, head bowed slightly, sunlight streaming across his hands, emerged as the defining image. It was not fame nor celebrity. It was remembrance, a quiet icon of honor restored. Back in Rock Springs, Frank's life remained unchanged in the ways that mattered. He still woke early, still brewed his coffee black, still limped to the mailbox with stubborn determination. The small house remained his sanctuary, the porch his watchtower. Yet something within him had shifted. Neighbors noticed. He held his head a little higher when he walked down Main Street. At the diner, when strangers approached to shake his hand, he no longer flinched. At dusk, when he sat on his porch watching the sun dip behind the Wyoming hills, his smile came more easily. Not from pride, but from peace. For years, Frank had carried the quiet burden of being unseen. Now he carried something else. The knowledge that his sacrifices had not dissolved into silence. They had been remembered. In the weeks that followed, letters poured in. Some came from fellow veterans who had served in Vietnam. Others from young Marines who had never met him but wanted to thank him for paving the way. Families wrote too, sons and daughters of men who had served, who saw in Frank a reflection of their own fathers and grandfathers. He read each one carefully, some aloud, some silently, and placed them in a wooden box beside his study desk. He did not respond to them all. He didn't have the words, but each one deepened the truth the captain had made clear on that flight. He was not alone, and he was not forgotten. One evening, Frank's granddaughter sat beside him on the porch, her uniform crisp, her future in the Navy stretching before her. She turned to him, eyes bright with determination. "You know, Grandpa," she said softly, "someday I want to serve with the same honor you did." Frank looked at her, his expression softening. He reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "Honor," he murmured, "isn't something you wear. It's something you live. Remember that." The stars spread slowly across the sky as silence settled between them, comfortable and enduring. The world would move on, as it always did. New headlines would replace the old, new stories would capture attention. But the memory of that day, the salute, the standing ovation, the return of dignity, would endure. It would live in the hearts of those who witnessed it, in the minds of those who read it, and in the soul of the man who had once thought himself invisible. Not all sacrifices are written in medals. Not all battles end with banners. Sometimes all it takes is one voice to say, "We remember." And when that happens, even a seat on an airplane becomes something sacred, a return to dignity, a return to honor, a return to home. Because in our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Frank Delaney knew this now. He had lived long enough to see it proven true. And as he sat in the stillness of another Wyoming night, the wind brushing across the hills, he smiled, not for recognition, not for glory, but for the simple, enduring truth that he had been seen. At last.